Hi everyone, so we've now come to a break point in the module, and that break point is everything leading up to the end of the 1960s, start of the 1970s, and everything after that. So up until the start of the 1970s, it could be argued that there was a very clear pattern to geography, or academic human geography, from the point at which academic geography emerged in the late 1800s. You did seem to have a general pattern where, for the first few decades, human geography was dominated by the environmental determinism paradigm or approach. In the next few decades, in the early 1900s, it was dominated by the traditional regional geography approach, which of course had two separate schools associated with it, the French approach, or the French school, and the German school. And then in the mid-1900s, you start to see spatial science become a more dominant approach. From the 1970s onwards, you tend to get a different picture where you have a number of approaches all existing at the one time. And the question really has to be asked is whether any of these, to any degree, achieves a sense of dominance within the subject, any of these different approaches. So we do have a multiplicity of approaches. So on that basis, it could be argued that maybe Kuhn's model really doesn't work anymore. Others might argue that maybe there are periods where one particular approach in geography does achieve some degree of dominance, or even today it could be argued that. That's my personal argument anyway. Maybe not to the same extent as, say, traditional regional geography in the 1930s. But anyway, there's a few thoughts. So what we're really looking at in the next few lectures is what came after spatial science, or sometimes we refer to these as the challenges to spatial science or the critiques of spatial science. Today sort of follows on from that last part of the October 20th lecture, which wasn't really on October 20th, but you know what I mean. So at the end of the spatial science lecture, I offered a brief introduction to behavioral geography. And behavioral geography was a critique of spatial science on the basis of its lack of a human dimension. The approach I'm going to talk about today, humanistic geography, takes that ball and runs even further with it. And in some ways, it's probably, at least in terms of methodology, probably the exact opposite or the mirror image of spatial science, a very, very different approach to studying and doing research in human geography. So the readings there, they're on the slides. Again, yada, yada, yada. I'll give you a selection of readings. If you read one, that's great. And again, if you're reading, try to do active reading in that. Don't just gloss through the chapter. Read through it, pull out the important ideas, write down the important ideas, put them away, keep them. Don't put them away, keep them, because there's a good chance they might help you with the written assignment. There's a good chance these ideas could help you in the end of module exam as well. Okay, so this is the point I made at the start, so probably should have waited until this slide to make that point. The idea that the 1970s marks this break point in the trajectory, oh, that's a big word, in the development of academic human geography. And again, as I said before, there you have the general picture. If you're trying to kind of fit the history of geography around Kuhn's model, that's the general picture you're getting there. So kind of this pre-paradigm phase right up to the late 1800s before geography becomes an academic discipline. First dominant approach, environmental determinism. Second dominant approach, you have a crisis phase, you have a paradigm shift. Second dominant approach or paradigm, regional geography, which, as I said before, had two separate schools associated with it. This crisis phase after World War II, and then a third dominant approach or paradigm, spatial science, moving into the mid-1900s. The general argument is from the 1970s, it's harder to apply Kuhn's model because there's just too much going on. There's far too many different approaches all existing at the one time. So in As I said in the previous one, in the spatial science lecture, I introduced you to behavioral geography. Today I'm going to talk about humanistic geography. Then the next two lectures, looking at the other side of the coin, the other critiques, the other major critique offered against spatial science, looking at the more political dimension, looking at Marxist geography and radical feminist geographies. So in the 1970s, there are probably about 6 or 7 fairly significant approaches all existing at one time, and things get bigger and bigger. You get more and more approaches emerging as you move into the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Perhaps interesting to note that really, from this point on, any approach that emerges doesn't really get discarded to the same extent as it could. Probably environmental determinism was effectively discarded in the early 1900s. So approaches don't become dominant, but they don't disappear as well. So spatial science is still very much with us in a very different form to the way it was in the 1950s and 1960s, but you still have quantitative geography, you still have humanistic geography, albeit again in different forms. Behavioral geography and ideas from Marxist and feminist geography are still very much part and parcel of modern academic human geography. So this is the point I said about the previous slide. If you kind of took one interpretation here, you could say, okay, Kuhn's model had some usefulness up until the end of the 1960s, start of the 1970s, because it could be argued there were dominant approaches at various periods between the late 1800s and the early 1970s. Environmental determinism, regional geography, spatial science. And then after that, everything changes. Now, some people have argued that maybe Marxist geography did achieve a period of dominance for a period in the 70s and 80s. And when I start to talk about Marxist geography in the Wednesday lecture, or which will be online, in what would be the Wednesday lecture slot, I'll talk about that, and I'll talk about the extent to which it's really maybe not the pure Marxist ideas, but the general kind of leftward swing in academic geography, how that's had a pretty significant influence, not pretty significant influence, a very significant influence over the development of academic geography, effectively across my own lifetime, the last 5 decades and a half. So one interpretation of Kuhn's model and how it can be applied is to say that really from the 1970s onwards, there wasn't really a dominant approach. We just have a lot of different approaches all existing at the one time. Now, again, I'll talk a lot about this when we look at critical geographies, particularly in the last part of the module. I don't 100% buy into that idea, because I think if you look at how human geography is developed, there are certain dominant trends in modern academic human geography. Modern academic human geography has a very strong left-wing basis to it. It's very hard, if not impossible, to find any academic geographers pushing right-wing political views, and those of us in the centrist camp really aren't particularly influential, to be honest. So I think there are dominant strands and dominant trends running through modern academic geography. It's not this higgledy-piggledy mix up on confusion and multiplicity that most people try to portray it as. Okay, so we are looking at the period in the early 1970s where spatial science starts to become critiqued. Now, you've seen this slide before. I talked about this at the end of the spatial science section. Spatial science starts becoming critiqued. It's a bit of a sucker punch for spatial science, because it took so long to win the battle with regional geography. Like we said, if we were trying to apply Kuhn's model literally, really, spatial science, there should have been a short paradigm shift. in the early 1950s, and from the mid-50s onwards, spatial science should have been the dominant approach. It wasn't really. It kind of regional geography remained pretty influential, probably into the early 1970s. In a country like Ireland, you can push that forward another 10 years, maybe. So spatial science had a long battle to achieve dominance. And in some ways, the use of Kuhn's model by geographers, mainly by quantitative geographers, was part of this process of trying to claim, look, we're now the dominant approach. Look, if you take Kuhn's model literally, what we've seen in the last few years is this paradigm shift. And really what you're seeing is natural. It's natural that after a period of time, the old approach, in this case regional geography, should fall out of favor, should fade away, and a new approach, namely spatial science, should take over. The crying shame for spatial science was the end of this process, literally the very point where people could say, you know what, spatial science probably is the dominant approach in geography. This point probably arrived at the point in time where all these other approaches suddenly emerged on the scene to start to challenge and critique spatial science. It really didn't enjoy too long in the sun. I'm sure it makes all your hearts bleed. Anyway, what are the critiques of spatial science? A lot of the critiques of spatial science had to do with the models that were used in the 1950s and 1960s. And again, I make this point again and again and again, the models were limited, but they had to be limited because geographers, spatial scientists, quantitative geographers really didn't have a lot of tools at their disposal to engage in statistical modeling. So you had to simplify the models. And when you simplify models, you're leaving things out. And a lot of the issues, particularly with the humanistic camp, a lot of the issues that people had with these models had to do with these simplifications. For the humanistic geographers, the big issue for them with the models was the fact that the models, this economic man assumption, the models effectively took away all elements of individuality, all elements of human agency. And yeah, that was a big problem for them. The issue for geographers on the left of the political spectrum, the radical feminist geographers, the Marxist geographers, their issues with the models was more about where these models came from, where the ideas from these models came from. Because as I said before, a lot of these models weren't actually models that were drawn up by geographers initially. A number of these models and ideas had already been developed in other subjects, particularly classical economics. And in the case of classical economics, a lot of these models dated back to the mid-1800s, and they reflected the politics of the time, laissez-faire capitalism, neoconservatism, and were very much, if you look at them, a lot of the models are location theory, industrial location theory. So a lot of the models are furthering the interests of business owners as opposed to the general public. Now, we're not talking about the radical geographers today, but their critiques, as I said, had more to do with the political dimension, and they pinned down this claim that spatial science was scientific, it was neutral, it was politically neutral. Their main issues with spatial science was the fact that really it looked as if the models in spatial science really were doing very little to help address social problems, address social inequalities, to promote social inclusion. The other issue was the point I made on the previous slide. I probably should again, damn it, held this point to this slide, the point that a lot of these models drawn into spatial science came from classical economics and came from a particular era, the era of laissez-faire capitalism, the era of neoconservatism. And the general argument put forward by Marxist geographers, radical feminist geographers, other radical geographers, their general argument was basically there was a politics to spatial science, and the politics reflected where these models came from. It was a neoconservative politics. But today we're going to talk about humanistic geographers and humanistic geography and their critiques. their critiques really focused in on this economic man who would be operating with perfect knowledge, this assumption, which was part and parcel of a lot of the early models in spatial science. And that for them was a key issue, the fact that there was no attempt to kind of take account of individual human behavior, human agency. And the spatial scientists would have probably said, well, yeah, how can we do that? We just don't have the computing power to do that. But in any case, the humanistic geographers would say, well, maybe you shouldn't be doing science then. Maybe you need to do geography differently. To which the spatial scientists would say, bug off, and the humanistic geographers would say, bug off to them. Anyway, moving on swiftly. So that was one of the big issues. And as you can see, the only resolution to that issue for the humanistic geographers would be, look, we have to do things differently. We have to do geography differently. And we have to use a different methodology. We can't be scientific. If we want to take account of human behavior, we don't agree with the spatial scientists. We can't be scientific. We need to use a different approach. We forget about trying to explain things. What we need to do is try to understand things as well as possible. The other big change was the key concept for humanistic geography. Remember, regional geography, the big concept was place, studying regions or places. Spatial science, the big concept was space. Going all the way back to environmental determinism, the big concept for determinism was space as well. When we move on to Marxist geography and radical feminist geography, we'll see again with those two approaches, the big concept for those approaches is space. Now again, the understanding of place is different in humanistic geography to that of regional geography. The understanding of space is different in Marxist and radical feminist geography to that of spatial science, and indeed that of environmental determinism. So if you can cast your mind back a few lectures ago, we talked about this division in the different types of knowledge: empirical, analytic, historical, hermeneutic, critical science, and how human geography might sit within them. So this idea that human geography sits on the boundary between the natural sciences, the humanities, and the social sciences. And the idea as well, as I said before, that different ways of doing human geography, different approaches, may align human geography more with one of these. In some cases, the natural sciences, in other cases, the humanities, and in other cases, the social sciences. So to use an example there, you can see probably spatial science brought human geography more in line with the natural sciences. Again, think about the big philosophy, positivism, the idea that you could study humanity in the same way as you could study the natural sciences. Humanistic geography, as with regional geography, definitely it's a case of they're definitely more in the historical hermeneutic side of things. And you're seeing an approach to geography that brings it more in line with the humanities. If you look at, say, Marxist geography and radical feminist geography, later on critical geography, and indeed much of postmodern geography, you'll see a more natural alignment between human geography and the social sciences. So very much in the camp of critical science. So the humanistic challenges to spatial science. The big argument, I've said it a few slides back, that you should be trying to look for meaning rather than trying to explain, rather than developing scientific laws. So human geographers cannot consider themselves to be law-applying scientists because they have no laws to apply. The idea instead of trying to explain, instead of going down the route of drawing up theories, developing models, and ultimately trying to develop a new geographical law, the argument was instead try to understand areas and communities, but do it in a certain way. Try to understand areas and communities on the basis of local perspectives. So this idea of trying to get the voice of the people who are being researched, rather than researching outsiders imposing their own views on this. And again, the point as well that you get this space versus place conflict between spatial science pushing the importance of the concept of space, humanistic geography pushing the importance of the concept of place. Now, there's different ways humanistic geographers could account or make use of spatial science, and this is covered in the old version of. This is covered in Naik and Jeffrey's book. Sorry, the older version of Naik and Jeffrey's book, the first edition, pages 54 to 57. Because my book's back in minute, I can't double check it, but I'm pretty sure it's probably covered again in the newer edition in a different format. So humanistic responses, different ways humanistic geographers could respond to spatial science. Extension is it's what I would be personally advocating for. The idea that, look, there is a value to spatial science. There is a value to numbers. There is a value to quantitative techniques. Quantitative techniques will give you the big picture. You can use these as a first step in research. And we'll see this come up again when I talk about the locality studies and new regional geography in about 3 or 4 lectures' time. The idea that, you know what, okay, spatial science has its flaws, it has its limitations, but if you want to get the big picture, there's a lot to be said for making use of quantitative techniques. If you're going to talk about, say, unemployment, what's the natural starting point? Gather your data, gather your unemployment data, map it, and then you can move on from that and you start to use more humanistic techniques, use methodologies that are more associated with humanistic geography. This is a process that is often referred to as exploratory spatial data analysis, that you do this kind of groundwork in advance of the next step of research. So do your quantitative analysis, get the big picture, get the big trends, and that'll do different things for you. It'll give you the general idea or the general trends, which you can look into in more detail and more depth with more qualitative research methods. But it might also highlight patterns that you hadn't, trends and patterns that you hadn't thought of before, and that could steer you in a way that you might have thought of before you did this this quantitative research, this number crunch. And then the idea then would be, okay, once you've that done, then move on and use other methodologies to get a more in-depth understanding of what's happening. Methodologies that you would probably associate more with humanistic geography, qualitative methodologies. So this is one way that you could have a humanistic response to spatial science. This approach, you don't bother throwing out the baby with the bathwater. You take away some of the bathwater, you let it down the sink, and you add new bathwater to that to, in your mind, make things better. The other approach, revision. This is where you throw away the baby, the bathwater, and the bath as well. You just say, spatial science is totally useless, there's nothing to add, and let's just start totally afresh. Let's just do geography in a totally different way. Two philosophies underpinned the ideas of humanistic geography. So the key philosophies were existentialism and phenomenology, and I'm delighted I managed to say them without slurring over those words. You can see all the key philosophers there: Sartre, Kierkegaard, Heidegger, the people associated with existentialism. Basic idea: people create the world by mentally projecting meaning onto the different things they encounter in everyday life. Existentialists also, as it says there, they talk about this sense of existential dread, that people have this inbuilt sense that they're alienated from the world. And to try and counter that dread, it's important for humans to try and make the world that they encounter in everyday life comprehensible to them. So what ideas come from existentialism into humanistic geography? One of which is the social concept of the social construction of place. The idea that places are made meaningful through the thoughts and actions of the individual human agents who encounter those places, who live in those places, travel through those places, etc. So this concept of the social social construction of place. And this idea that place, space is socially constructed starts to become more and more part and parcel of geographic thought, not just with humanistic geography, but also Marxist and radical feminist geography as you move on into the 70s. So this moves away from the idea that places you can look at place and space as things that are totally neutral, they're just containers. This suggests that places and spaces have identities in and of their own rights, and as part of this process of the social construction of places and spaces. Existentialism also, as it says there on the slide, highlights the fact that everyone's experience of the world is unique to them, and generally argues the best way of doing research is to get the view from below, a locally specific, grounded view from below, namely to try and hear the voices of people in a specific local area, get the locals' voices, and let those voices guide your research. Don't let the research be guided by you as this researching outsider coming into an area. Okay, the other key philosophy, probably in some ways the most significant of the two philosophies, is phenomenology, associated with a philosopher called Husserl Luce. This is concerned and interested with the subjective knowledge of the world, how people bring their own opinions, their own attitudes with them when they perceive and encounter things. And this is a philosophy that generally rejects scientific methods in favor of approaches that focus more on trying to better understand, get deeper forms of understanding. Now, how does phenomenology impact on geography? Well, in terms of research, the general focus here is on moving away from scientific methods, moving away from trying to explain, to instead trying to get more intensive forms of description, of understanding, where you're taking account of the experiences of individual humans. Another key idea coming in here is the life world concept, trying to overcome dualisms between subject and object, or mind and matter. And again, the focus on getting the locally specific grounded view from below, which we mentioned already on the previous slide, or in the two slides back when we were talking about existentialism. Okay, so it's Naik and Jeffrey, again, this quote is from the older version of the book. They talk about humanistic approaches being about seeking to explore the significance of human experiences as to how we understand the world around us. As Naik and Jeffrey say, from the viewpoint of humanistic geographers, the places we inhabit are not universally understood. Their meanings are being produced and reproduced all the time through different people's experience. Okay, one good way to always think about an approach and how it might differ from others is to think about the methodology or methodologies associated with that approach. As I said a few times already, in terms of general approach, humanistic geography is very different to spatial science. And we see the exact opposite being particularly evident here when we look at methodology. Spatial science, obviously, the big focus is on quantitative methods. For humanistic geography, it's all about qualitative methods. And this is an approach to geography that gives more emphasis, starts to see more emphasis being given to interviews as a research method, as well as focus groups, participant observation, and other ethnographic techniques that would have probably been drawn from anthropology. 2 lectures back there, I talked about behavioral geography using surveys, and particularly closed question surveys. Humanistic geography, if it uses surveys, they're surveys that have open-ended questions. So they're basically questions that allow the respondent to give their own opinions in their own words. Another key method associated with humanistic geography is this idea that you can interpret different texts. So text here could be understood as the way you'd normally understand it as a book. But humanistic geographers talk about other texts as well. Landscape can be a text, archives can be text, maps, the cinema, visual images, and so on. Place is the big concept in humanistic geography. Spatial science was all about space, which in some ways was a reaction to the big focus, the dominant focus within regional geography on the concept of place, the region. There's much more emphasis on the concept of place in humanistic geography, but was a very different understanding to that of old style traditional regional geography. And you start to see new ideas about place and new ideas related to place coming into geography with the emergence of the humanistic geography approach. Obviously, there's a focus on place, but they start to also talk about sense of place more, and they talk about a concept called placelessness. Now, the big concept here is on place, was looking at how places are shaped by social forces, and in turn places can act to shape human culture. The idea being put forward is that places evolved through different approaches, including human agency, and this is going to be a key element for humanistic geography: human agency, individual humans, the actions and thoughts of individual humans, social development, and historical accident. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to mainly look at some of the most significant humanistic geographers, and I'll give a lot of emphasis to one in particular for two reasons, which I'll explain in a few minutes. The first geographer we're going to look at here is a man called Yifu Tuan, who was a Chinese national, had a very distinct style of doing geography. You read his books and they're very different in tone and in structure to most other geography textbooks. His big idea that he put forward was that of topophilia, which was an idea put forward in a book by the same name in 1974, looking at the very close bonds that exist between people and places based on memories or pride of ownership. He talks about how this sense of topophilia can vary from person to person. There can be cultural variations. He talks about how attachment to home place can vary in scale, and how topophilia can actively produce places for people. This sense of topophilia is a stark contrast with placelessness. I'll talk about placelessness more when I move on to Ted Ralph, but he also talks about another concept called topophobia, places that can instill fear or dread in people, which was an idea put forward in the book called Landscapes of Fear. Ted Ralph, a Canadian geographer, very much shaped, his ideas shaped by phenomenology, very much focused around the idea that people need to practically know their places, and he's concerned about what he calls authentic placemaking, making places authentic placemaking, making places more real for people, ensuring a stronger sense of place in people. And the exact opposite of that, which he calls placelessness, and how these different processes become manifested in the landscape. Ralph's main idea, and his big concept, is placelessness. His big idea is that the sense of place, the extent to which people are attached to place, he argues, as society becomes more modernized, more urbanized, better organized, as governments take a more hands-on role in managing society, his argument is that sense of place is being undermined, leading to what he calls the creation of flatscapes, where places start to look the same, feel the same, sound the same, and a placeless geography. So what is placelessness for Ralph? He says it's the existence of relatively homogeneous and standardized landscapes, which diminish the local specificity and variety of places that characterized pre-industrial societies. So he says as society becomes modernized, things are starting to look and feel the same. If you're taking this line of logic, you could say, well, if you were to be suddenly, if you were an alien and you were to be dropped into Mullingar, would that feel that much differently to if you were dropped into, say, Derby in England? Would the housing estates look pretty similar? Would the shops look pretty similar? Would the same shops be in both towns? Would shopping centres look the same, feel the same? So this idea that as society becomes more modern, more urbanized, better organized, you start to lose the quirkiness, the weirdness, the uniqueness that you get with individual places. He talks about authentic attitudes of place and forces of places. So the big forces really modernization, urbanization, government, the role of government in fostering this. And he talks about an objective artificial public world being part of this. So placelessness. Okay, we move on to the geographer we're going to focus most on in today's session, and that's Anne Bushemer. And we focus on Anne Bushemer for three reasons. Obviously, one of the leading humanistic geographers, perhaps the most influential of the humanistic geographers. She only passed away a few years ago, but definitely someone who left their mark on the world of geography. She was the head of the IGU for a number of years, which is basically the body of global geographers. So someone who had a major impact on global geography. As most of her career was outside of Ireland until probably the last decade or so when she moved back and became head of the department in UCD. As someone whose impact probably had more impacts as much globally, if not more globally, than in Ireland. So that's the first reason. Second reason, one of the few female geographers we have encountered so far, and we'll talk about this in 2 lectures' time when we look at radical feminist geography. And third of all, it's nice to actually finally see an Irish geographer being mentioned among the greats. Now, E. Eston Evans, previously when we talked about regional geography, he definitely did get to a point where he was looked on as one of the leading regional geographers in the world, but definitely Anne Bushemer's influence is huge. The first slide really, there's a lot of quotes there, but I'll skip over the big idea. The big ideas of the first slides was, where did she come from? She came from the rural part, eastern countryside, rural eastern County Cork, growing up there in the 1950s. And basically the first argument put forward here was that really for her, she couldn't find, her sense was that spatial science didn't really resonate for her. It didn't make sense for her based on where she came from. Instead, going down the path of humanistic geography was something that resonated more for her because of her own personal background. So Anne Bushemer, again, like with Ted Ralph, drew a lot on phenomenology. I thought I'd get through this lecture without mispronouncing this. Anne Bushemer drew a lot on phenomenology to provide ideas and concepts in terms and language to try to help her get across her ideas. One of her key concepts was the life world concept I briefly mentioned already, our Lebenswelt. Again, as I said, this is someone who operates in different parts of the world, including Germany. So Lebenswelt, you can even see her using the German terms here. The life world, the totality of everyone's involvement with the different places and environments that you experience in everyday life. For Anne Bushemer, she says it was important that the human condition be explored, the human condition be given the respect it deserved. And she says you need to honor the experiences, imaginations, and attachments of intentional human subjects. So she's always important. She has is always interested and concerned with subjective knowledge, subjectivity, the need to unearth the subjective level and recognize its influence. And you see this in our work. Now, this is one of the interesting things you will see with humanistic geography. Sometimes humanistic geographers, when they're writing, when you're reading most academic work by geographers, it's usually in the third person. If you look at some of the work done by humanistic geographers, they will start to use the I term in their work. And they'll also, so this is an interesting thing to note. So if you do find you're doing a specific topic for GY310V or for your single major thesis that actually lends itself to a humanistic approach, then it's okay for you in that case to use the I term in your research report, so long as you justify that in your methodology section, of course. And you also get stories of childhood being drawn into your own academic research as part of this. So very different to spatial science. Sense of place is a big concept for Anne Buttermer. She talks about sense of place in terms of how it relates to people's personal identity and cultural identity. She talks about immigration and how this can be effectively linked back to sense of place in terms of a loss of home, but also losing one's place as well. She always considers sense of place as particularly being brought to consciousness when a place is threatened. So you can think of, on a bigger level, if a country is about to go to war, a sense of place, or at that level, a sense of loyalty to the state definitely comes to the fore more than would be the case in normal times. You can also think of sense of place when there's a GA match coming on. That's definitely a point in time where sense of place comes to the fore. Sense of place around Buttermer, she says, is a strong element of everyday life. She says you'll see it in literature, you'll see it in politics, and in popular song. And you'll definitely see this at times of major change. One of the ideas Anne Buttermer put forward is that she says there's two different ways you can view a place. You can view a place from the view of insiders, and you can view a place from the view of outsiders. And she's talking particularly of rural areas here. So she says insiders, they are living in the place the whole time, they experience this. Okay, they love their home place, but they don't have a particularly romantic notion of their home place. They don't have a particular kind of, they won't kind of glorify their home place. It's where they live. If you're a farmer, it's where you live, but also where you work. So you experience the place and you have a functional understanding of the place. Outsiders coming into rural places are observing the place and they're looking at the place. They don't give a monkeys about farming because they're not farmers. They're looking at the place more in terms of its aesthetic values. So these are concepts or understandings, and Buttermer says, that can come into conflict. And you'll see this with planning. So people living in an area would say, look, we want to build houses in our own area. This is our land, this is our home. I want to build a house next to my parents. I want to live in my own area. Why can't I do so? Outsiders on the other hand say, no, that's going to ruin the environment, or that's going to ruin views, or ruin the aesthetic pleasure we get from driving around these places in our cars, polluting the environment. But let's not get into that. You never think I come from rural Ireland. So Anne Buttermer says, look, we have different ways of looking at places from the views of insiders and outsiders, and you look at language to see how these differences come to the fore. She says, one needs to probe to a deeper level of meaning, hopefully to find common dialogue between those who wish to live in places and those who wish to plan for places. Now, critiques of humanistic geography. Some people say, this is an argument that Mark puts forward quite a bit, is space getting an unfair press? Okay, place is important, but is there a value in the concept of space? And as well as that, is there a value in the concept of kind of large spaces that don't have a lot of sense, don't have a strong sense of place uniqueness, but large spaces that you can just get lost in for a while, that you can hide in, and that you can kind of, in a way, reinvent yourself. Other critiques focus around the importance of place attachment. And some critique humanistic geography for having too nostalgic a view of places. Some people will say, look, there are bad places, there are regressive places, and maybe sense of place could be viewed as a public bad. Marxist geographers and feminist geographers, they've two major critiques. One of the critiques is this idea of regressive places. So they say, look, you humanistic geographers with your rosy tinted glasses, your nostalgic views of places, don't you realize some places can be threatening for people? Can't you realize that some places can be oppressive for people? Their other argument is to say, look, come on, this is Mickey Mouse. You're talking about individual people, but places and spaces aren't created by individual people. They're created by bigger social trends. They're created by large social structures. For the Marxist geographers, they're talking about capitalism as causing this. For feminist geographers, they're talking about the patriarchy. Right, everyone, the final point to note today is that humanistic geography, the big concept of place, as we saw, it's a different understanding of place to regional geography. We start to talk about social construction of places. We start to talk about concepts like the life world, placelessness. It's all about human agency. It's about how humans engage with places, how they interpret places. We talked about insider outsider views. We talked about topophilia. Regional geography, the big concept was also place, but traditional regional geography had a different way of looking at and studying place to that of humanistic geography. I'm not going to over-elaborate on this because this is something I'm going to cover in 3 lectures' time, but in the 1980s, 1990s, you start to see other new perspectives on place being developed. Doreen Massey is a key person here, probably one of the leading geographers of the late 1900s, early 2000s, and she starts to talk about how different ways of looking at place and how this new way of looking at place could be important to actually make sense of bigger global trends. So one of her big ideas is a study in place does help you to grapple with bigger trends, global trends, such as, for instance, in her work, global economic restructuring. We'll also see humanistic geographers or historical geographers as well. I won't go into this too much in the upcoming lecture in 3 lectures' time, but they also start to put forward new understandings of place, taking account of ideas drawn from structuration theory. Now, I will briefly talk about structuration theory in 3 lectures' time as part of that particular group of lectures. But anyway, it's nearly 50 minutes, so I think I'll stop it there. And the next 2 lectures, we're going to look at the other critiques offered of spatial science and the other new approaches that emerged in the late 1960s and 1970s. So up to now, we've seen 5 different approaches. The big ones up to late 1970s, environmental determinism, traditional regional geography, spatial science. We've looked at 2 of the approaches that emerged in the 60s and 70s, particularly critiquing spatial science for the lack of a human dimension. We briefly looked at behavioral geography 2 lectures back. This lecture today looks at humanistic geography. The next 2 lectures are going to look at critiques of spatial science that have more to do with political viewpoints, for want of a better word. Effectively, left-wing critiques of spatial science and new approaches that are more radical and left-wing in their stance than any geographical approaches that we've encountered up to now, with the exception, of course, of the anarchist geographers who we briefly mentioned, Reclus and Kropotkin at the end of the session on environmental determinism. So bang on 50 minutes. I'll leave it there. Bye.